next 2 minutes, can I please request Dr. Govind and the other panelists to, some of us are already here, but Apar, I think, please feel free to carry your tea and snacks inside.
Good afternoon, everyone, once again, and I hope everyone's back with their coffee and refreshments. Good evening, everyone. I request everyone to please settle down. I hope you've got your coffee and refreshments. We'll start with the last panel for the day, and over to Mansi Kedia from ICRIER.
Thank you, Gangesh, and welcome back. This is the final session for today. I'm glad to introduce you to our distinguished panelists. There's Anita from IT for Change. She's the Executive Director for IT for Change. Dr. Govind, former CEO for Nixie. Apar, here he's the Executive Director of Internet Freedom Foundation. And Puneet, he's Senior Associate Policy and Advocacy with Luthra and Luthra. I think it's sort of a privilege to do the last panel because there are lots of learnings from the previous panels. And when I had sent out the email to the panelists, I was thinking we'll do a present, past, and future sort of discussion in the Indian context for internet governance. But we've already covered a lot of the past. For those who are not present in the morning, there was a lot of discussion in the first panel on how internet governance actually evolved, the people who were involved, how India got involved in the discussions, and so on and so forth. So, but because Dr. Govind is here, I thought we don't want to miss out on the past. So we will focus a little bit on the past, but more on how it is evolving in the present and based on the experiences, and each of them have very distinguished experiences. So I think we'll go on to the future. I mean, I want to place this responsibility before our panel as moderator. I'm going to impose it rather, is that Secretary Sawhney had raised, in the morning that he wanted to, for us to give recommendations to MeitY and to the government on what could be done. So I hope that as a part of this discussion that we are having right now, we are able to arrive at least 2 or 3 things that, we can propose to the government. And not to say that the previous discussions, didn't offer any solutions, but if we are able to package it all together and have 2 or 3 at least distinct recommendations for the government, for MeitY, and for the other departments and ministries as to what could be done for us to make internet governance more coordinated, because that is the challenge that I think everybody has spoken about, working in silos, build more capacity, again a challenge, and something which is more comprehensive because people, okay, so it's not just about the government, it's not just about the businesses, it is about you and me, it's about us. So with that, Dr. Govind, your opening remarks, if you can speak a little bit about your experience and what you've learned and what you think we should be doing today.
Thank you, Mansi. And I'm grateful to ICRIER and MeitY for organizing this important event and in inviting me as a panelist. In fact, I was thinking, it's a very right occasion for ICRIER and MeitY to revisit the entire landscape of internet governance. Because over the years, because we were becoming very stale in the whole dialogue processes, whole discussions. So because what I think sometimes, we are at the very critical juncture, especially at the role of internet governance is losing its earlier stance. Because it is no more those multi-stakeholderism versus multilateralism and all those stance which we discussed from 2003 to 2015. So I will, other issues which are taking up are the fake news. Someone talked about the internet shutdown and the internationalized domain names, local languages like Secretary talked about in the morning. artificial intelligence, IoT, big data, data protection, Bitcoin, blockchain, data localization, digital economy, cyber stacking, root servers, right to privacy, and more importantly, now we are in the data governance. It is no more the internet governance, because internet governance is already there. So now we have to talk about more how the internet and through that the data, because today we are in the data economy. How the IoT governance, AI governance, all kinds of governance are going to take shape into the entire gamut of this internet governance issues. Because I was at the center stage at these, as Mansi told me, that in the beginning, right from the WSIS process in the ministry way back in 2003 and 2005, the main issue at that time was the unilateral US oversight over the role of internet and the root of the internet, which contains the names and numbers directory for the global internet registry system. Expectedly, the interest in this subject was mostly of the foreign affairs ministries and developing countries and came from a traditional geopolitical standpoint. So we have to see how the past has given rise to this kind of issues, like genesis of IG was the Tunis agenda, where international management of the internet should be multilateral, transparent, and democratic, and internet governance forum was evolved way back in 2006. I will not go into those, detailing there, but what I will say that the Tunis agenda also talked about the need for an enhanced cooperation to enable governments on an equal footing to carry out their roles and responsibilities in international public policy issues pertaining to the internet, but not in the day-to-day technical and operational matters. It should be inclusive, democratic, participatory, multilateral, and transparent in nature. India believes that the global internet governance can only be functional, effective, and credible if all relevant stakeholders contribute to and are consulted in the process, like private sector, civil society, government, industry, and all those kind of things. Then there were CURP and other kind of thing, which I will not go. Then there were Net Mundial happened in 2014, global multi-stakeholder meeting in Brazil. India's strategy and position on the internet governance side, I remember in the ministry, evolved over a time from 2005 to 2015, when the Honorable Minister gave to the multi-stakeholder stance, and we talked about that in the Buenos Aires. I think realizing the critical importance of strengthening India's domestic internet governance processes, playing a dominant role in regional and international level, India adopted this multi-stakeholder process in 2015. But back home, because no process internationally you can participate unless you strengthen your local capacity and local infrastructure. So from there, we set up the National Internet Exchange of India. Mr. B.C. Jain is here and other ISP is here. The first National Internet Exchange of India in 2003. Today we are operating in 7 or 8 places like Delhi, Calcutta. Mr. Satyan Gupta is here, whose recommendation from the TRAI was, triggered us to work onto that kind of thing. And you remember how the whole ISP community and the telcos were, decided to set up the first neutral exchange, and that too because there was a fight that where it should be, whether it should be in the, Bharti or whether it should be in the BSNL or any other telco. No, then they decided should have a neutral place like STPI, where the government will set up the infrastructure and others will join there. Then the other major important milestone was the .in Internet Domain Registry. We recasted the whole Internet Registry system, .in domain, way back in 2004, evolved a policy, and 2005, January, we came up with the new policy and framework for this new Internet Registry. Then the National Internet Registry, again, Mr. B.C. Jain is here. We all, through NIXI, got together and talked to the APNIC if we can have a national internet registry for IP addresses and IPv4 and IPv6 allocations, because that was very important that point of time, because India is a huge country where we can allocate our own IP addresses rather than getting directly from the Australia. Then the local languages, IDNs brought it up, and then the Digital India. Because all these things, as from the morning to this time we heard, because India is the biggest users of internet. But unfortunately, we are the biggest consumers of internet. We are not the production. We are not producing any internet technology, internet applications, internet thing. We have a huge market, but we are just making use of internet, but we are not, like industries are never there to work for a very important application which can be a global footprint for the India. Then we have a 4G and 5G kind of thing. Then we have a Digital India program which was launched 2014. So this present stance, as I think this gives an overview of how the past worked in India about the internet governance. And then we were participating in those time, I will say from 2005 to 2014-15, so enthusiastic teams were there. I mean, we were all working for a goal. Look, we have to set up, these are the critical infrastructures. Then we set up the root instances, not the main root servers, but the instances F, I, K. And today, Ms. Samiran told me that we are having more than 20 root instances in India, 22. So that's a great path, because root servers and the instances of root servers, they are one and the same thing, because internet will never go down if you have instances of the root servers which are a mirror copy of the original root server working in the country. So, but nevertheless, there is a case, as Saikat Datta said, we can still we can ask for a original root server, a kind of infrastructure, which I think it can come anytime, and it depends on our dialogue with the global players. Even in the IGF 2019 in the Berlin last time, the main issue there was how to make a digital inclusive footprints in the country, in the globe. It's not only the data governance, but the freedom of expression and working ensure there is one interconnected and global internet, but it should be more inclusive based on gender, race, identity, and income. And this should be on the one network. Then security, safety, stability, and resilience are the paramount for the internet to achieve this potential. So that also worked throughout the whole process of internet governance. And this whole concept is evolving as more and more users are getting into the internet, and they are more using the financial transactions, the business transactions, the entertainment. Every step you need a kind of things which is not there in the original thing. Of course, there was original aim was access, diversity, openness, and the security, and then the critical infrastructure was added into the whole gamut of internet governance themes. I think we had 2 meetings of internet in this country. One was in 2007 and another 2015, or Internet Global Conference. And we had a IGF meeting in 2007 in Hyderabad. So, we were working, and we should have a more global conferences like Anupam Agrawal talked about how to bring the IETF, the standardization process. That's very important for any global player to come into the country and see how the things are going to happen. I will stop here, and then we can move further.
Thank you, sir. That was, I think, a great historical summary of how internet governance has evolved, and also pointing towards some of the things that ought to be done and followed through in the future. I also want to admit that, in the beginning when you were listing out the things that mean internet governance right now, and I was recollecting in our head that if whether or not we are working on it, and I was, and we ticked marks that, okay, we worked on data localization, we worked on shutdowns, we're working on these issues, so thank you. I'm going to turn to Apar, and I'd like you to, do you want to go after Anita? Yeah. Okay, sure. Anita, you're good to go? Sure. Okay, so I I was hoping that, in our informal conversations, we've spoken about, a more comprehensive approach to thinking about internet governance, and you've always spoken against it not being binary. So if you can focus on that and bring the people and the process bit into the discussion.
So as I heard through the conversations today, I was just thinking what my position is. Is my position that India has done nothing? Is my position that India has been too quiet? Or is my position that India has certainly been a global leader? And where are the ambivalences? Especially the previous panel pointed to the innumerable forums and the ways by which there is a complexity here as to, which forum really is important, vital, critical, etc. So I just want to touch upon a little bit, because my organization, IT for Change, has been part of the global civil society, but we have worked very, very closely with the Indian government and the developing countries, which in the internet governance spaces. So one thing I wanted to recall, and following up from what Dr. Govind said, was about NetMundell in 2014. This was very important because this was a meeting called forth by the Brazilian government. And there India maintained that the internet is not merely an open, free global commons that should remain untouched by governmental control, but instead a resource that needs to reflect the values of an Equinet, a platform for commerce, e-governance, national security mechanisms to be achieved through fair playing rules established by, and I quote, a globally acceptable legal regime and a new cyber jurisprudence. There were many things. One of the things was that the increasing claim of corporations, especially commercial interests in that forum in 2014, led to a somewhat hasty, hammered together set of recommendations, and India didn't sign on it. The recommendations also had, suddenly it introduced copyright related issues, and there was this entire set of claims about the place of ICANN, which was also, it was following the Snowden catastrophe, and ICANN was also on the back foot. And at some level, therefore, there has been an evolution in perspectives in terms of an idea of sovereignty, an idea of taking leadership to assert that there have to be public policies around the internet, and India has been vocal around that. Also, these formulations around globally acceptable legal regime and a new cyber jurisprudence, I think, should not be dropped at all. I think these are very important historical utterances which really we need to anchor our future debates in. The second and often buried historical narrative I think I would like to table here, which is I think lost in history, is the Working Group on Enhanced Cooperation, which was constituted between 2016 and 2018. This was so many years, a decade after the WSIS process, when finally the mandate that was given at the WSIS in the UN was picked up, and a working group was set up so that there can actually be a global governing framework, a policy framework, binding or otherwise, for the internet. Very tragically, but quite predictably, the group could not come up with a consensus. We were a civil society representative inside the working group. And the conclusion of the group was, we really struggled and fought to keep commercial interests at bay, as well as ensure that the internet will not just be taken over by state power. And that struggle really was mirrored in the fact that the conclusion of the report the group was, the complexity and political sensitivity of the topic did not allow the working group to agree on a set of recommendations. So that was very tragic, and it's very, very recent. So I think it's useful to remember that post-2014, post-2015, with the platformized internet, we are actually witness to a new political economy. The global impasse with respect to finding a democratic internet governance model has also meant that critical questions of internet public policy issues are now being discussed in various other forums that not all of us in this room may really be completely cognizant of. For example, the governance of data flows is now being discussed as a digital trade policy issue. So the fact is that internet civil society globally and in India, they come in from a tradition broadly, and I don't mean to overgeneralize, of cyber libertarianism, professing a certain kind of techno-libertarianism and utopianism that reflects a deep antipathy to anything that is close to public policies. So it's been a very big ask to shepherd some kind of consensus building and carry civil society, which is obviously always difficult in issues of human rights, but to actually build some kind of a cogent articulation around what is it that we seek with respect to internet-based public policies. But I think I also really, really love, when I go back to one of those public policy moments in India, I really like the way the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India came up after the Free Basics controversy, and in that contestation made a very, very important assertion. What they actually said was they used the principle of internet egalitarianism, and I think that is a very useful terminology to open up some kinds of articulations, and we can preserve that. Interestingly, the civil society group that led the entire Save the Internet campaign was completely opposed to a position that IT for Change, for instance, took, that there has to be exemption in network neutrality as regards public interest content. That is, if you're educating users, providing information about elections for electoral rights, for rights vis-a-vis Aadhaar, rights vis-a-vis things, the position we took was all content is equal. However, some content is more equal, because in public policy interest and in the interest that we are dealing with access questions, we should actually not treat commercial content and public interest content and public content on the same level. But there were disagreements in civil society with respect to that. So in some sense, I think what we are seeing here is the technical is but a reflection of the political economy, and I want to unpack that a little bit more. We are living in times indeed where there is no binary between the online and the offline. It has no meaning actually. I'm connected, my devices are connected, most of you are tweeting, some of you are actually doing office work here. So sociality and economic relations are all now mediated by the space of flows, and to that extent the internet governance is no longer only about managing the internet's address book and root zone servers. It's of course about it, but it's not only about it. It also has to do with the pressing challenges of how to govern public policy implications about the economy and society. What I want to do is to actually point to what the UN Secretary General said at the opening ceremony of IGF Berlin that Sir already spoke about. He said that, of course, fake news, misinformation, these are very, very important to address, but there's one more thing. And he actually pointed out that new technology has contributed to a steep rise in the number of billionaires over the past 20 years. And he underlined that this kind of inequity that goes with the rise of the internet is totally untenable, and we have to do something about it. And he recommended that we have to recover the idea of public goods on the internet. And this is a kind of recommendation I'd like to put on the table for discussion. What is the meaning of public goods when we talk about the internet? I believe it's a range of things, from public standards to public content, public platforms, e-marketplaces, and much more. Of course, we still have the question of access. Last year, the finance minister had declared somewhat grandly that all the panchayats are going to be connected, but we sadly lag behind. And this year again, the honorable minister has rededicated resources. I mean, we have the problem of dark fiber. At the last mile, nobody knows what to do with the broadband. And in some sense, we missed the bus on the institutional infrastructure with respect to high-speed broadband at public clinics in the villages, at public schools in the villages, etc. And that's really, really something that for a country of our scale and the problems that we face is a shame. I think that we should really be doing something about that, and our 5G revolution is certainly not going to take care of that. The demand for local language content in India is also growing at a very rapid pace, and lo and behold, I was startled with these statistics. Some of you may not be, but maybe you also will be. Nearly 40 million users of the internet, Google tells us, were added from 2015 to 18, and 9 out of 10 such new users are Indian language users. So the entire generation that's coming onto the internet is not reading the English language content on Twitter or Facebook. They're all users who use local language content. And one more very, very significant fact, they don't consume text. They only consume video and audio content. So we are actually dealing with an entire generation, none of whom may be represented in this room, who are different kinds of internet users. And what are the policies to address their economic and social needs and rights? I think that's a very important question. We have a problem of deepfakes, online sexism, misogyny on pandemic proportions. And in our research at IT for Change, we found something very, very disturbing. We found, and this was on, this came because we spoke to young men in colleges. And all those young men told us that for their training on how to be macho, they went to WhatsApp groups. They went to these groups online, which were all homosocial private male spaces. So that is where they learn what it is to be a man. And there, normally, they're fluent with expletives, making sexualized memes, asserting male entitlement, hooking women. One boy is telling the other boy, you know, well, why not hit at that girl? And using fake profiles and whatnot. So there is a certain cultural quotient that's developing on the internet about which we are completely clueless. Although we know about it, we don't know what to do about it through public policy. So other than the freedom and privacy concerns, we have a new generation of rights that are making an appearance, and we have new sets of actors. And one set of actors I really want to table here are very important. These are traders. And traders, since the last year, have come together to repeatedly point out the anti-competitive practices of large e-commerce companies, and they see a certain collusion between the government. They allege a certain collusion between the government and Amazon and Flipkart. We know that the Competition Commission of India has also come up with a report just this month or last month, and it's actually said that in the e-commerce sector, we recommend a set of self-regulatory policies, and it's also called for some more market studies. I think this is a frontier we should watch out for. And finally, some comments on the future. I'll just take 2 more minutes. I think on content governance, we have come a full circle. It's quite funny, because the initial time was a very low threshold for liability, you know, because there's ambiguity in the definitions, etc., and intermediaries could easily be penalized. And then, of course, there was Shreya Singhal, where there was a reading down of the idea of what actual knowledge is. And then, of course, now the court has intervened and said that proactive filtering is necessary for child pornography and for videos of rape. We are now waiting for the new intermediary guidelines as we speak. But I think in this regard, we should really look at the Brazilian experience with the Marco Civil da Internet. I think India desperately needs, and I want to underscore that as civil society, a civil rights framework for the internet. We can't be each time going to the court for interpreting this and that and the other. And of course, I think several generations would have died before, you know, we actually have a bunch of jurisprudence which talks to human rights on the internet. So we do need that. And I think that we should actually go to a notice and notice regime, which I don't have time to get into. It may seem like technicality, but I think many of us are seized of these things, where the burden on the intermediary should be lessened to an extent that, you know, there is the author of content has an opportunity to take down content. We treat uncivility and civility as a matter also of a cultural discourse, rather than each time having the intermediary regulate and the government regulate, etc. And we also need a situation where there is greater clarity on what it is that the intermediary should do. I also want to finally say that India has been very active in the trade arena with respect to digital trade. And this is something we may not really be cognizant of, so I want to place this on the table. Firstly, India has pushed for a revisiting of a permanent moratorium on electronic transmissions. So back in 1998, you know, there was a declaration in the WTO that global electronic commerce, there should actually be a 2-year moratorium on customs duties on e-books, video games, etc. Nobody actually thought that, you know, apps are going to come on mobiles. But today, what's really happening is developing countries are really suffering on account of this moratorium, which lasted beyond those 2 years. Because some countries decided that the moratorium should last because the content was coming from those countries to the rest of the world. And so last year, South Africa and India have argued that this moratorium for not levying customs duties on electronic transmission is asymmetrical. And it creates a negative fiscal consequence for countries like ours, and it has a negative impact on our industrialization. So this is a very important thing. EU and US are not budging, but India, South Africa, and to some extent Brazil are putting their foot down. The second thing that India has done, and it has done it because of ambassadors in Geneva, who are again at the vanguard of negotiation of trade, is it's saying no to the plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce. And it's saying that, look, the US wants to do various things, and just as we speak, the US is negotiating an important accord at the WTO, and it is shielding website owners from lawsuits and state prosecution for user-generated content. And it's using a particular term from an ancient, GATS kind of, agreement, which is called interactive computer services. And open brackets, some more legalese, limiting non-IP liability for suppliers and users and infringement of persons' rights. Basically, the long and short of it is, how can Facebook, Google, Twitter not have any liability? This is it, and it's being negotiated right now. And actually, Shoshana Zuboff has pointed out that this is what happens in the US. And in the US, there is a US legislative statute called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and it continues to generate huge controversy in the US, and it has economic repercussions, not just political and social. Finally, I do know that it's very controversial, but I would like to say that this idea of a critical national resource, data being a critical national resource, came up in the Osaka Declaration last year when India went and said that it is a critical national resource. I wish to underline that as civil society, we have to take a position that there is multivalency of data. Data means many things. So if data also means me and myself and an inviolable, inalienable right to my data, it could also mean in other avatars a resource. A resource does not always mean property, and therefore a resource could also be a common property resource. So that's a teaser. I'm just leaving that to indicate that we don't have to govern everything as private property. We could govern data in many other ways. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. That was like a 360 on internet governance. You covered a host of issues, but lots of interesting points. Also the perseverance on having a global governance model, and also, I mean, data is I think is a much more complex issue that I think we need a separate session on. But yeah, point well taken that I think we need to rethink and carefully think about how to deal with data. Now coming to Apar, and I know that you're involved on a daily basis in probably formulating some of these policies related to internet governance, not in the way that we've imagined, but through cases and instances that have happened. So if you can highlight a bit on that, focus on the process and whether it's good, bad. Yeah.
Thanks, Mansi, for having me here. A warm welcome to everyone here. I think I've substantially benefited from the comments both by Govind and Anita, who have looked at much more global aspects of internet governance, but have also, in their remarks, somewhat teased and looked a little much more closely every now and then, episodically, at the domestic policy formation institutions within India itself. And internet governance can also be understood in a sense that how our domestic institutions, which are essentially at the ministerial level, which may include regulators, which also are aligned with that ministry, in addition to the other branches of the state, which will include legislative bodies, as well as courts, are formulating specific policies which are determining how close to 600 million connections in India are actually exchanging data and content through digital modes and mediums today. And this has a much more direct impact. Of course, the international governance processes and the architecture itself is important. However, the domestic policy formation institutions quite often have a much more direct and a much more immediate impact rather than the long-term view. So today, what I aim to do in a short period of about 5 to 10 minutes is go through what have been certain good practices, best practices, which I have noticed over some period of time with respect to how this kind of process can be further strengthened, gets a higher degree of democratic legitimacy, and also benefits from expertise from a diverse range of players. And I wouldn't like to combine it within multi-stakeholder versus multinational. What I would like to indicate is that the public consultation processes which are being followed in India to a large degree are improving but need to be further improved, and they by themselves offer a very good hope at least in terms of how we are forming policy at a much more national and local level to reflect what are global best practices itself. So if we start nationally and look much more immediately within ourselves, we may be able to build a better capacity and policy-based response to what may be a higher degree of dysfunction which may be operating at the international scale. So what can be certain objectives from a public consultation? The first is, by its very nature, is that what are the reasons behind the very administrative decision or the government policy decision which is taken, which can be furthered through transparency, and here I mean meaningful transparency. It does not only mean at a later point in time putting forward draft legal language, but ideally should have pre-consultation on the very interests which need to be identified with regard to that specific area. So for instance, if we are dealing with intermediaries and changes to how large platforms and their powers have grown over a period of time, we should not look at the specific legal instrument which should be, for instance, the Information Technology Act and the rules, but we should point out the underlying concerns which need to be ideally addressed through a legal regime which may or may not be there. Okay, so and if those interests by themselves to a greater extent are meeting what can be within the bounds of a constitutional framework, within the powers of government, and within the fundamental rights which are there for each person in India. The second is to encourage citizen participation. And again, this should be meaningful. If you put out a draft legal language by itself, it will, and open it up to a public consultation for 15 days to 30 days, you are by itself presuming and inviting a certain degree of comment only from professionals and resource persons who may be working in companies or in policy formation institutions which are much more legally oriented and have that level of training, as opposed to computer technologists as well as larger policy professionals such as economists who are sitting here and who may be able to in fact input in and actually build into the very integration of the recommendation at the very level before it steps to legality. And here in citizen participation also what may help is that there should be approach papers, there should be an explanation of the entire process, and all of this does come with risk. I'll come to that in a little period of time. The final interest which needs to be met through public consultation and will be the hardest, especially for government, will be to invite a diverse set of viewpoints. It's my feeling whenever there are diverse set of viewpoints, the foreseeability of circumstances increases. So for instance, if you have two opponents, and this comes from also my experience from the courts, when you have an adversarial sense of a certain degree of contest of two viewpoints, you do not go with whatever is a centrist viewpoint so as to see compromise. But if you do it in a very good manner, you have a larger scale of foresight and visibility, which is very necessary in policy technology formation processes by itself. So if you have a civil society group and you have a group which is in fact stating for a higher degree of security and national security concerns, which have traditionally undermined issues such as free expression and encryption, then what you will notice is a higher degree of forcibility in what conditions encryption as well as these use of technologies can be limited, and in what uses and institutional frameworks there can be safeguards which can be built in. This is already happening, but this can be deepened further. And to do that, I will go back to certain good practices which I'll be doing. However, there's an absence of consistency. And I'll also come to the reason for the absence for consistency. So the good practices which we see sometimes happen through ad hoc groups which are created. So for instance, when the Justice Shri Krishna Committee was constituted, it had a full consultation which included an approach paper. Then it invited comments again after the approach paper responses were there. And all of the responses to a large degree were not published online. Now you contrast that with the intermediary rules draft which was put up to consultation, and the responses to that were published online by itself. So there's if you see in the public consultation process within one ministry, there's an absence of consistency, and you do not see a higher degree of predictability that these are the timelines we will broadly follow, these are the steps we will generally take. Okay, this will actually help people to participate in a much more meaningful way, also to do open houses, okay? And one final thing I would like to just add to this is that we quite often focus on the executive branches of government, but quite often these same policy questions are now arising in Parliament, which is now not only having a standing committee for IT and electronics, but has had two substantial committee reports on technology issues. One coming, which is right now under deliberation through a JPC set up on the data protection bill, and the second being an ad hoc committee, which is constituted by the vice president, which is headed by Jairam Ramesh. So what one notices again is that the JPC and the ad hoc committees by themselves may be functioning very good and very well, but they're again undermining the institutional legitimacy of a standing committee which already has established power and mandate to conduct its activities. And again, there are several comments I can make that how the standing committee process can also be improved, but at its very root, the level of participation which can be noticed in these kind of bodies is not happening at present. This is not to say everything is dark and everything is gloomy. If one looks at the latest TRI consultation paper on network neutrality enforcement by itself, they are contemplating a two-tier or a single-tier model in which civil society, diverse stakeholders can be a part of not only providing advice, but also setting the very policy how such kind of network measurement should take place, and when violations of network neutrality are made, recommendations can be sent ideally to the Department of Telecom. And what impedes us and what we should look towards the future is in terms of an Administrative Authority Act. It exists there in the United States. Even though we have a pre-consultation policy which is made in 2014, it does not capture a lot of these policy formation processes which are taking their place there at the ministerial levels. And the ministerial and the executive branch can also benefit from a higher degree of predictability where senior level bureaucrats know that what is the defined process. This act was actually referred also by Honorable Justice Rohinton Nariman when he struck down the specific rule which was made with regard to call drops and compensation, and he indicated that a strengthened, much more robust public consultation framework may build a higher degree of forcibility. It may bring a much more rational policy formation processes. Not to say public consultation is not without risks. Firstly, the first risk is what researchers and experts in policy institutions called is death by consultation. It's that there are too many consultations taking place, but you do not see a meaningful advance, where the politics and theatrics of consultation itself are not a meaningful measure of actual stakeholder participation. This is because civil society groups in India also lack legitimacy and power, and this is fair to recognize. And these questions are there already in the minds. They are quite often not stated. So we need to build a greater amount of trust in terms of these inputs. The second is, in terms of when you encourage public participation, there can always be a high threshold and a low threshold of participation, where there is a over-flooding in terms of responses, which can actually lead to special interest capture, or if it's a core civil rights issue or a fundamental rights issue, it can lead to majoritarian determinations which impact fundamental rights, which are usually to protect the people who lack power, the minorities, right? And in terms of the second order risk is in terms of lack of participation. So for instance, the TRAI consultation I talked about, it has participation, even though from the heydays of the network neutrality movement, where more civil society institutions did participate in processes, after 3 years, what one notices is that there's a lack of capacity either in civil society or a lack of interest. So there have been only, I think so, 1 or 2 responses by civil society groups, and the total number of responses to that consultation number in around 20. So a lack and under participation itself is a risk in public consultation itself, which also then gives rise to a necessary inference that civil society groups in India quite often are under capacity, which also requires government to actually step in and strengthen their mandate. With this, I would just like to place certain recommendations, which are, again, just for the benefit of this audience. First, consultation should be seen in terms of interests and its design. Consultation can be for the sake of consultation. Secondly, consultation can be through a higher predictability if there's a unified policy or a legal framework which is made, which is similar to the Administrative Authorities Act. And finally, there are always risks to public consultation, which can be mitigated by factoring them in from the very beginning in the consultation design. And I hope that these kind of processes are something we can all work towards and build towards in a multi-stakeholder model.
Thank you so much, Apar. I think that was according to me, very constructive in terms of what we can actually do, because public consultations are very core to policy making for internet governance. And in fact, Sir alluded to TRI's process in the afternoon, and Apar also seemed to congratulate TRI. So I think we have something going, and maybe if we have a guided code of conduct for these public consultations, we can make them more efficient and much more effective in terms of outcomes. To Puneet, just carrying forward from what Apar finished by multi-stakeholderism, I just want to understand that, we have adopted multi-stakeholderism, and there are lots of, civil societies and different bodies getting, interested in internet governance policy making. But in your opinion, how effective has this been? Because Apar did point to the challenges or the risks of public consultations, but in general, how effective do you think multi-stakeholderism has been, and what we can do to improve this in the future?
Thanks, Mansi, and thanks to ICRIA for having me on this panel. Just before I jump to your question, and I do have a lot to say on that, I want to, first on the broader theme of what the past, present, and future of internet governance looks like. I found Dr. Govind's framing of internet governance changing to data governance very useful. And Anita's point about platforms now being sort of centers of governance again is, I think, what the big shift is. But I just want to add a little more nuance to that, in the sense of, if you look at many of the processes that were discussed before, and even if you just went back to the minutes or the sort of declarations that came out 5 or 10 years ago, where we were at was we were looking at very process-based outcomes. We were looking at what should a process of internet governance look like, who should be the constituent actors in these platforms, how do we build sustainable platforms for internet governance. However, now this is switched, and now if you look, you don't even have to go to these sort of meeting minutes or these obscure policy documents. If you just read the news today, you'll see that half the issues are actually, as Anita said, real-life issues. They're not technology issues. If you look at fake news, if you look at privacy, if you look at financial technology regulation, all of them have a layer of technology, which means to say that the transformation over time from internet to data governance has meant that the centers of governance are not necessarily the international bodies, they're not necessarily your domestic regulators, but they're these sites of contestations between users and platforms, between the government and platforms, and users, governance platforms, civil society actors. So it has become much bigger and much broader. But I also want to add another point to this to say that none of these debates are new. That privacy, for instance, has always been around. Questions you ask around e-commerce, like Anita pointed out, is 20 years old. If you ask some people, they'll take you back to ITU declarations that go back a further decade. But what has happened now is, because of the spread of technology and the way it has evolved, these discussions have now become more urgent, and it requires policy responses on many levels. And that brings me to the very important distinction that Apar drew between domestic internet governance and international internet governance. Having had the benefit of straddled both worlds, I just want to start off with what we found on international internet, on India's engagement with international processes, and then come back to what our experiences are in the more recent past in engaging with regulators. So just to plug a very old report, 2 years ago, we spent a lot of time looking at how Indian actors engaged with internet governance institutions. And we looked at data, I think, between 2011 and 2016 to just identify what are the kinds of things Indian actors are saying, how are they doing it. And I want to discuss 3 important conclusions we came to, which I think are still relevant to this day, though the report is a bit dated. Is when you look at participation itself, Indian actors usually, and this is something that's missed in a lot of internet governance debates, though it's articulated in different ways. If you look at how much time an Indian internet governance actor, this could be a civil society representative, this could be a company representative, or even government sending their representatives to internet governance meetings, we found that most of them are at best defined as part-time actors. And we define this as, I think, spending something like 12 hours a month or something like that. And we found that every forum you looked at ICANN, you looked at IT, you looked at the WSIS process, we found that maybe they spent like 12 to 15 hours a week. This is, I think we looked at 60 different actors. And that for me is, I think, the biggest indicator of where we can improve. Not necessarily a criticism, but the path forward should start from here, that we don't have enough people spending enough time on these questions at international fora. And there are two important consequences to this. One is the fact that someone's engaging part-time. When you look at the counterparts from other countries or even from other organizations, is that you lose out on a lot of institutional knowledge. The fact that you have part-time actors means also that people are cycling through, that it might be one person this year, and the next 2 years it might be someone else. So what we had found then, and I think it continues to remain true to a large extent, is that there's no consistent engagement at any of these platforms. There is to a large extent, and people like Anita, Parminder are all examples of people who stayed in the field for a long time. But the large experience has been that there's a sort of cycling in and out of people who engage with these platforms, which means that not necessarily the Indian government, but Indian interests at these platforms kind of wax and wane based on one particular issue. And second, and this is not necessarily unique to India, is that people didn't have funding, people didn't have training. So what would happen if, as a consequence of that is you would go to a meeting, you'd figure it out. Maybe by the third meeting, you know what is going on. But you already spent a lot of resources trying to figure that out. And as I had said, if you link that to the cycling in and out, by the time the second person comes, they're restarting from scratch. And again, I want to emphasize that not that these problems haven't been raised before, not that these problems haven't been dealt with. I think MeitY in the past has played a very important role. Both Dr. Govind and Santosh are sitting here, have been supportive of, I think, a number of diverse group of actors in supporting them. But I think the demand that has been there for a few years, and I think is a little more urgent now, is the fact that you need a consistent core of actors. You need consistent training, if not necessarily, because a lot of these meetings, I think now you can follow online as well. You need a consistent group of people who can sit on these sort of issues full time and engage with these platforms. And coming to the substantive issues that we found in Indians engaging with internet platforms, we found that usually, and this is, again, you could see it as a consequence of the kind of debates that were happening, was Indian engagement was also largely limited to process-related issues. If you looked at the INR transition, we were asking about accountability, we were asking about transparency. If you looked at the WSIS process, we were again saying, where are the Indians in these platforms? Where are the developing country participants in these platforms? But we weren't necessarily engaging on the most substantive issues that were involved. So to give you an example, and I think Anita flagged this earlier, digital trade has been on the menu for the last 10 to 15 years. And I have a slightly different take on this, is if TPP had passed, we would not be in the position where we are today, where we can be dictating terms on issues like data flows. In some ways, we were lucky, but it also meant that we got by until the last couple of years or so without having a consistent take on what India's position should be on data flows, irrespective of the substance of those issues, that we didn't necessarily have a consistent view on what our trade policy should be, what our domestic policy should be on e-commerce. And one of the solutions to that is to have a more coherent link between our domestic policy making, and I guess this is true of any field, not necessarily technology, is to have a more clear line between what's happening domestically and to have Indian actors, and this is not necessarily limited to government, but the kind of coalitions that we build when we go outside of India should reflect the sort of consensus we have on a number of issues. And here I do have a very useful example of something that was done, and Apar sitting next to me is an example of this, is when the net neutrality movement happened. It didn't just happen in the domestic sphere, and I think we've been in meetings where this was also then reflected globally. And our experiences and learnings on net neutrality are also now beginning to diffuse in other jurisdictions. And we have a lot of opportunities to do this now in this very moment. So if you look at something like UPI, which is an India's developed standard for payments, this is being diffused by corporations across the world, but it's a very much an India product. And I think we can do a better job, whether be it in government or civil society or as private actors, to sort of make this link between what are we talking domestically, filter down to what are the issues that would be beneficial to the wider community and not just any one stakeholder, to raise this at these international platforms. And that, I think, would help sort of re-energize the multi-stakeholder model, re-energize the idea of having wider consultations and wider discussions. And my final point is on domestic engagement. And now I spend most of my time speaking to regulators, so I have some interesting things to say here. As Apar pointed out, the pre-legislative consultation policy has been around since 2014. It includes mandates to discuss emergent policies or legislations with a wider group of stakeholders. But for whatever reason, it's still at the policy stage, so there isn't a lot of teeth to that policy, and there isn't necessarily an onus on regulators to implement or conduct any sort of meaningful consultations. But an interesting piece of research that I discovered over the last few months is NIPFP and Carnegie have both looked at what sort of regulators engage more widely with constituents, and they found that it's the regulators who have a statutory mandate to engage with domestic stakeholders. So if you looked at how an RBI does policy in India and compare it to what TRAI does, TRAI is relatively a more open regulator. They hold consultations. RBI has started doing it now on some issues, but the big difference is that the TRAI statute requires them to hold consultations. That mandate exists in the law. So when you have any regulator sitting on a pressing question, I think they would also have more of an incentive to conduct consultations, to have meaningful dialogue with any number of stakeholders. And the reason this is becoming more important, at least from a domestic standpoint, is, again, the regulator is not just MeitY now, it's not just TRAI. Arguably, if you're looking at a platformized internet, I would argue that DIPP is the one that's been the most sort of engaged, the one that is, for a lot of the policy questions that we're now discussing, be it competition, be it consumer protection, they have through, again, arguably not the most effective instrument, but just through the FDI press notes have done so much regulation that is not necessarily within the mandate. And this is only beginning to expand. So if you look at fintech, it's the RBI that's regulating it. Even if you look at the way technology companies are structured, SEBI has been very active there. And if you look at the new Consumer Protection Act, they argue that the act states that sharing data without consent is a consumer violation. So we're looking at a very diffused, decentralized regulatory environment. And if you're looking at strengthening participation there, I think there needs to be some structural change in the way regulators engage with stakeholders. But at the same time, I think we need to stop viewing as internet governance as any sort of discussion between one or two or three stakeholders. It's far more diverse and it's far more informal, would be my closing point. Thank you.
Sure.
I think you people raised very important points, but even in the domestic dialogue process discussions I have seen in the either by civil society, Media Nama, or the SFLC, or the NLU and others, the industry partners, local industry partners are missing. Mainly we deal with either Facebook, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and all those, but not our own local industries. That is a must, because when you are formulating a discussion or any kind of recommendations, if you don't raise the questions on the how it will affect, like intermediate guidelines or the data protection or the data localization. So unless we have a framework, as Mr. Puneet brought it out, and we should have a very concerted, consistent discussions on these points, not that just we gather in various places around Delhi and then we come out with the kind of certain aspects. And we should involve all the stakeholders and see that they are there, and maybe ministry can also work on this and set up a kind of consultation process with the relevant stakeholders, rather than leaving it to the NGOs and other kind of forums. Thank you.
No, absolutely right. I think we have several instances ourselves of trying to engage in research and trying to engage stakeholders, and we've found it extremely difficult to get inputs, especially from the set of Indian IT companies. I don't know the reason why, but it's been difficult. But that.
Is it okay if I respond to Puneet?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks. It was fabulous listening to both of you, Apar and Puneet, and I really take home those important, I think, public administration considerations of what a consultation is. I mean, of course, we are not a mature democracy in that European sense where everything is enshrined in the rule of law, but to get there, I think, is vital, because we also boast that the internet has made governance and citizenship, all of that, so much more accessible. One point I wanted to make is that on data flows, of course, everyone in the room knows this. The reason why we never had a very concrete position was because of our own BPOs, our software industry, etc., right? I just wanted to ask a question. It's like a, end of day quiz. When do you think the EU made its, nobody can look at the internet. When do you think the EU made its data strategy? It made it on 19th February 2020. It released the paper on 19th February 2020. So at some level, I think, and they came out with a very interestingly, why did India then start taking a position on data flows and also start articulating its own ambitions on data localization is because post the software and data flows debate is the AI debate. Honestly, we have friends from Niti Aayog here. Our AI strategy paper came from the Niti Aayog in 2018, 2019 with all those identified areas, and we suddenly realized this is not about software anymore. The game is about AI. So what you see in the EU also is a kind of knee jerk, this is only after the competition commissioner in the EU has woken up and Trump has declared, I shouldn't say that, President Trump has declared that, she really hates him. He tweeted out that she really hates us. And this is official, so I can say it, although the moment is inappropriate. The fact of the matter is that EU has woken up to this data flows challenge only now. So I'm saying that it's a very, very redeemable situation as far as India is concerned, because the EU's come up with a white paper on AI, and it says that they will come up with a Data Act 2021, which is the same ambition as we have for our non-personal data. So at some level, we should, of course, be looking to a much more empowering Personal Data Protection Act. But I just wanted to lay these facts on the table to say that nobody is behind the game, because all of us are somehow reacting to those behemoths.
Thank you. Yeah. No. Please go ahead.
No, yes, I mean, I agree with you completely on everything. The EU paper is definitely very interesting. That came last week. And on trade, again, it's a very controversial issue. I don't want to step into anything here, but I accept that, every country is now sort of knee-jerk reacting to it. I came to a lot of these discussions from a trade perspective, and even 5-6 years ago, they were fairly advanced papers from the EU and other stakeholders on a framework for data flows, and I think a lot of that was already concretized to a certain extent in the TPP. My point was simply that it was simply, in many ways, a matter of luck that the TPP didn't concretize and India would have been left out of that regime. We're lucky, and of course, that it's never too late to engage on these questions. The fact that it's gone away is definitely an opportunity for us to continue engaging on those questions.
I'd like to take this opportunity to actually open up the panel for audience engagement, because we are running behind schedule. But before we do that, I'd like to just sort of thank all the panelists for expanding the scope of internet governance. We were talking about, building capacity in the morning and talking about engaging in multinational fora. But now I think there are new issues such as data governance and digital trade that have come up. And also some interesting recommendations, but those are thoughts that I think those are things that we need to think about. Any questions that we can take now from the audience? Anybody who has a question?
They must be all tired.
Yeah, that's possible.
Okay,
there is one question.
The question of, I'm Anand. I happen to have worked both in MeitY and Telecom a few years back, and before that in the Finance Ministry. The question of how India engages internationally, and especially the lack of interest of Indian industry, IT, and on this was raised repeatedly. And I think Govind put it very, very, very graphically, in fact. I think we must look at the way IT industry itself is. It's basically a service provider to the rest of the world. So there is no reason why they should be interested in setting standards. And if we look at another empirical regularity across the world, and in the electronics industry in particular, starting from the ASCII codes, the country which manufactured hardware set the codes. I mean, this is not a new thing that I'm saying. Right from the World War, standards were the way to protect market as well as create the market domestically. This is true for the US, this is true when the GSM came, this is true what China has done for the IT sector, for their IT sector, that is. So how long can we as a consumer economy actually afford to even set standards? In fact, think that we can set standards. I mean, that's the real challenge that we are facing today. And if we are looking at the problem that way, perhaps we might need to look at solutions from that perspective also. Because our industry will not be interested in doing it because it is its market is elsewhere, and even the little part of hardware manufacturing or design that's taking place is basically in the nature of outsourced design. So there is no reason why they should be interested in getting into anything of this kind of a debate at all.
Yeah, sure.
I think you are. Yeah, so ultimately we have to bell the cat somewhere. Industry has to come forward, invest in technology, invest in software, invest in research and development. Because ultimately it affects them. Because they will be outdated in no time, because we don't have any telecom gear makers, up-to-date kind of thing. We don't, even 5G technology, we were knowing that it is going to come in 4 or 5 years, but still we have not invested on that. So ultimately we will be benefiting, whether we are consumer society or we are not consumer society, if the industry invests and investment comes in the technology, because technology is the future.
Anybody else? Yeah.
So, sir, I think a large part of the engagement also can be encouraged by setting up offices, especially towards policy formation in technology, which may be centered in IT centers, because their culture itself is different. So if it's geographically located in Bangalore, it goes much beyond the geographical location to actually embedding with the culture of innovation which is there. And I say this from personal experience as a person who's grown up in Delhi, litigated in Delhi, but now spends a substantial amount of their time in Bangalore. And this is a cultural learning which comes there, and when you're there as a participant, it encourages another person to also involve. So I think the Delhi centricism which is there needs to be a bit more removed from the policy formation from the very initial stage, so they have an opportunity to actually become not only seeing this as we are companies, we only want to get funded, but they also become active participants in the regulatory and the policy side.
RI has the concept of moving the consultation process across the metros, like Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, Chennai, and other places. So even in this case, our IT case also, we can do a consultation process across the at least metros, and then get the feedback.
We have time for one last question.
Yeah, sorry if no one else has one, I'd like to.
Yes.
So we talk a lot about Indian industry participation, but I was just wondering, and something that we've discussed earlier is also, so even if we do reach a point where you're able to articulate a vision that you want nationally for your company and all of that, but how do we secure this process against like a regulatory capture by industry at some point of time?
You also want to
So industry capture basically inevitably happens, Gangesh. That's because the rule of law framework within a country quite often defines what is the quality of the participation. So industry capture or special interest capture is always a risk, but you can build in mechanisms to safeguard it. And this is why process-based asks, even though they sometimes may be gamed, they are not by itself unimportant. So if you have transparency by itself to a meaningful extent, if you have a diversity, and more importantly, capacity for groups which are not aligned with industry groups, which can figure out a funding model. Quite often, that's again an unstated sentence which is often there in these conversations. For instance, when Dr. Govind says that a lot of these conversations which are happening on the basis of funding from foreign platforms, so there's a degree of suspicion as to what is the actual policy recommendation. This is a suspicion which is there with government. We should acknowledge as civil society by ourselves, but it's also an ask to government to look at how do you support civil society and raise up their capacity to give you inputs where you may lack the formal institutional capacity to do so. So that level of partnership and also acknowledging that civil society will be an independent voice and not go along with what you say is something which I hope we'll discover and we'll build as a culture over a period of time. This is too high hopes.
Yeah, I actually have one highly disembedded vision type, and what everybody will leave the room thinking, why talk at that level? But the other more pressing and probably pragmatic intervention is some of us were there at a recent, one of those Scotch summits that was held, and there I think. There was this backroom conversations about the data protection bill is coming. What should we be doing about, this compliance? How will smaller players really comply? Because if you cannot comply, then you're not playing in the market, which leads to which reinforces the whole deal about the bigger players capturing the market. The regulatory capture is, of course, a linked question, but this, what do you do about a market that's already skewed? So I think concrete suggestions such as having a capacity fund institutionalized for smaller players, so that through capacity they also build a capability to be articulate and to come together as an interest group. I think there is an opportunity available there once the Data Protection Act becomes a reality, because I think business should really come together in the form of domestic entities who really want to, who have a stake in what's happening. So in terms of the utopic but very necessary thing, I really wanted to say that there's a small sentence that I want to quote from the UN Secretary General's speech at the IGF Berlin. He says, there is a real risk of geopolitical rupture, a great fracture of trade, security, and internet systems, and this is just around the corner. And referring to all those multiple Cambridge Analyticas which exist, everywhere, in this room, everywhere else, who are all the bridge builders between state and corporate power, essentially. You just go and offer your services to state, and you thrive because state needs AI, and state needs AI for its own surveillance. And corporate and state surveillance seems to me like but two sides of the same coin. He actually says, the Secretary General, low intensity cyber conflict between major states is not a future prediction but a feature of our present time. The potential dangers of this demand a much more vigorous collective response. Therefore, I think when we talk about internet governance, we should reformulate it as the need for not just a multi-stakeholder democratic internet governance at a global level, which will set the benchmarks for what those human rights are, but I think we must expand it to the democratic governance of digital and data infrastructures. So that when we rethink this framework, we really need something that's all-encompassing, which is inclusive of the first, second, and third generation human rights.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, all the panelists, for, I think, widening the scope of what we were thinking of as internet governance, and also to bring the focus to India. I think a lot of the discussion in this panel focused on what we have done and what we ought to do, and our institutions and our departments. So thank you once again. I'd like to call Rajat sir and Meti for doing the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mansi.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the hardest part of the conference, is to try and summarize what happened through the day, and it's a mug's task to do that. So I don't think either of us are going to attempt to summarize. As it's been said, discretion is the better part of valor. So we try and just take you through what's happened since the morning, and what we, ICRIER as an institution, will perhaps do in the future. But before I do that, let me sort of invite Mr. Santosh to provide a brief summary of our engagement. Jaideep Mishra ji, unfortunately, has got stuck in in a meeting and can't come, but Santosh will do the honors.
Thank you, Katiriji. So good evening, one and all over here. So today we had a conference on internet governance. So this is one of the deliverables under the project Mighty Internet Policy, which we have funded to ICRIAR during 2017. So there were many deliverables in the project, of which they were supposed to come with the domain name industry in India. Now for that report, it took them, more than a year. They were not getting various inputs from, there weren't any inputs in India regarding the domain name industry. And also there were, we had, as mentioned by the earlier panelists, we didn't have the consultation restricted in Delhi. The consultation was also made in Bombay, wherein which different registrars also were there in the room discussing on where we should go for the domain name industry. So this is the conference of one of the deliverables as mentioned earlier, which we had a 3-panel discussion. The panelist has deliberated on, say, various processes related to global internet governance institution, as well as what to do for the national internet governance per se. So as you recall, our secretary Ajay Sahni ji mentioned that he has asked us where we want to be in 2025. I hope we are having answers to that. I hope that a report will be provided by ICRIAR, and we will be seeing to that. And Ambassador Reddy also mentioned that thought leaders from the industry has to be there. During all the 3 panel discussion, we have seen that industry representation is not there in various internet governance discourse. Now, unless and until industry actively participate in this discussion, then only we can collectively represent at the highest position of the internet governance structure globally. Now, for your all information, there are few openings which is happening in ICANN, and tomorrow is the last date. So this is also an information to all of you. But as I remember, these are ICANN position, board position openings in ICANN. So we have BC Jain ji here, who has been representing in the ASO. So he has put in very much hard work. But yes, he had asked many questions, raising that after the meetings, what next? So I have been hearing from all. We have been having this kind of a discourse, but what next? So I think we will be reaching, one day we will be reaching at a position wherein which we can commandingly say that, yes, this is our position and this is where we need to do things. Now, during the second panel discussion, it was emphasized that standards is an essential thing, which Mr. M.R. Anandji also has mentioned. Then Shyamal Ghosh Saba also has mentioned. Standards create market, and it protects the market. That is what China does. And when are we going to come up with standards? Because we say that, okay, we are a service-oriented country, but we should change fastly, so that we should make standards, and standards can lead products. That too in internet industry area. And I thank Rajat Katuria ji and his team, and also we also have a team in MIT, which is called Internet Governance Structure Integrated Module. So besides funding ICRIER, we fund to CDAC Delhi also for similar kind of discourse. I mean, they do see what is happening across the different structures of internet governance. Then we are funding to CDAC Bengaluru on internet standards. So they are working hardly on, internet standards. And many of the people have participated physically on IETF. And we have recently funded a project to STPI on making resilient internet for India, which means that even if the international cables are cut upon, our internet will remain. So I invite, each and everyone to give some concrete proposal to MIT so that we can take up in future in the ministry. So once again, I thank ICRIER and his team for conducting this conference successfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Santosh, for those sort of remarks, gracious remarks. And ICRIER is very fortunate to have engaged with MeitY on this project. And I think, as I was saying in the morning, this is perhaps the beginning of a longer-term engagement, hopefully, with not only with MeitY, but with other stakeholders, so that we can, as a country, we can promote our own interests, both in international fora and domestically as well. So I'm not going to try and attempt to summarize this, which Santosh has already done. I will not attempt to summarize it, but a few takeaways that I was struck with hearing everybody speak, and I think we had a collection of very good and able speakers who articulated their points of view really well, so I'm really thankful to all of them. Gangesh will come back and give a formal vote of thanks, but from ICRIER's and from all our point of views, I think this was a very successful and highly, stimulating and rich content that was on display throughout the day. And it's probably a testimony that most of you are still here at the end of a very, very long Monday on the eve of President Trump's visit to India. So what I took away, I think that sort of two main things. I'm going to talk sort of conceptually of governance. And when I was sitting there listening to a lot of this conversation during the day, I was struck by something that I read during my grad school days, which was called The Logic of Collective Action. It's a treatise by Mansur Olson. And how does, collective action, how do actions get taken? And in that sort of treatise, which is very relevant today, and you can look at yourself around you everywhere, the idea is still very germane, very relevant, and very sort of stimulating, and the idea is very simple, is that if you have to have, collective action or social action to happen, then, which of the interests, so there are various interest groups in society. You can think of producers, you can think of consumers, you can think of civil society. There are multiple stakeholders in society. Which group carries the day, or which group's ideas often win the day? And the idea was the group, and the conversations, who captures whom, etc. We had that discussion during the panel discussions. Is that do you get captured? Is the process democratic enough? Are you liable to get captured? If not, then how is decisions taken? So stakeholders are subject to values, of course, and so the producers versus consumers versus civil societies, those interests, and often what happens in conversation, especially when you're talking about policy, and I'm not referring to the telecom case that is playing out in India today, but that could be a very legitimate example as well, is that often groups that are powerful and cohesive and have the money power or the financial power, they often win out, as opposed to consumer groups or civil society groups who are underrepresented, don't have the power to represent themselves, don't have the wherewithal, don't have the capacity, and don't have the resources to be able to make their point. So they're often either not at the table, and as somebody said, in jest, but I think it's quite relevant in a conversation around this. If you're not on the table, then you're on the plate. And it's a relevant comment. If you are not on the table, if you are not represented on the table, then probably your views are not going to get captured. And I think that treatise of sort of Olson, if you want to call it the Olsonian hypothesis, or how interest groups function, I think it was on display throughout the day. And I kept reverberating back to the time I was in graduate school to try to manifest what Mr. Olson or Professor Olson had said. So I'm going to sort of use that framework and spend a couple of minutes thinking about what I took away from this very interesting conference. And I think the whole idea today, India is, as articulated by the Secretary in the opening remarks as well, is that we've moved from 0.5% internet population or penetration to now maybe 40, 50%, 600 million. We've come a long way. We've come a long way in mobile subscribers. We've come a long way in internet subscribers. And we are going to become, we are already the second largest. Perhaps we might become the largest. We're going to overtake China, by the way, in terms of population. And therefore, I think in internet penetration also, we might overtake China. We might become the very largest country in terms of internet population, and it will become pervasive enough. So given that, given sort of the pervasive net of internet, given that there are so many subscribers on the net, and given that how much resources that both private and public sector spend here, our sort of representation at international fora, and there's so many that were discussed today, and I'm not going to name them, but I did talk about them in the ICANN, the IETF, the United Nations, the High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation, the Internet Governance Forum, the Open-Ended Working Group. There are so many. They're there. But our representation, and Samiran might bear this out because he's actually there in the representing India in ICANN, is that our representation in those fora is not commensurate with our domestic heft in internet and internet sort of applications in content as well as in penetration of applications. So there is a bridge there that we need to sort of cover. We need to bridge the gulf. And how can we do that? How are we going to be able to do that? And that we need to, I think that it was said throughout the day that we actually need to be able to bridge that gulf. And how we are going to do that is that we have to hark back to our domestic processes. You can't simply say that it'll drop like manna from heaven and we'll be able to overcome the gap. So to be able to overcome that gap, if you first recognize that there is a gap, you can't be in denial and say that I'm going to bridge the gap. First, one has to recognize, and I think I'm happy to say, at least what I heard, was that there is a fair agreement or consensus that the gap exists and we need to bridge that gap. So then you come back to your domestic processes and say, okay, what is it in the domestic processes that we need to do so that we are able to bridge that gap, to get ourselves to punch equal to our weight, if not above it. Right now we are punching under capacity, so we can actually do that. So what changes do we need to make to our domestic processes? And one of the things that I think Anita also mentioned this, and this is in the context of the e-commerce negotiations. Now, I completely agree with the point that is being made that maybe it's too early, maybe we need a PDP bill to be passed before we participate in the e-commerce negotiations. But turning a blind eye and walking away from the negotiations for whatever reasons it may be, I don't agree with the moratorium on taxation, whatever the reason, very legitimate reasons. We know we are suffering, or so it seems, suffering I'm using sort of in inverted commas, by signing the ITA 1, and therefore we didn't sign the ITA 2, because we didn't know what would happen in ITA 2. We were not prepared. We didn't know what would be classified as digital products. Maybe a car could become a digital product and come in duty free, right? Because the overwhelming value of the car today is digitized. And therefore, the fear was a lot of things that came in as digital products under ITA 1 could sneak through as digital products in ITA 2. So better be forewarned and don't sign ITA 2. Legitimate reasons. But the point I'm making is, why don't we say this in the forum? Why don't we participate and tell the rest of the world these are our concerns? And we are not taking sort of the advantage or the benefit of being a developing economy. We can articulate our thoughts upfront and say, we don't want to hide behind numbers or developing status. We said this is a legitimate concern. We are concerned about what could happen by the moratorium on e-commerce, and therefore we don't want to participate. I mean, we don't want to sign the e-commerce agreement, rather than saying that I'm going to be out of the process and I don't want to engage in the process. That conveys a signal to the rest of the world that you're the fall guy, you're a disruptor, as I was saying in my remarks. Often, one hears this in international negotiations, not in the internet. I haven't participated in internet governance, so I'm transposing what happens in trade and saying that you're the fall guy, you blocked the agricultural trade negotiations, you blocked the e-commerce negotiations, you blocked IT. So we are always treated as the fall guy. And therefore, to sort of see that we don't get branded again in this as being the disruptor or the spoiler, we should sort of increase our participation. I think improve, strengthen our participation, boost our participation. And that's where I say we need to improve our domestic processes. And I think this is what we did today, was a part of that exercise, so that we can get everybody's participation, and give it back to, and we'll prepare a report, give it to METI, and METI then can make the best use of all our collective wisdom. I mean, no single individual, as was clearly mentioned through the day, no single individual will have the capacity to deal with such complex issues that the internet is throwing up. Even today, you start talking about internet, and then you slowly start talking about critical information, you start talking about infrastructure, you start talking about data governance, you start talking about data flows. You don't know where the boundaries are, because the internet by its definition doesn't recognize any of these boundaries. So you have to be on the ball, you have to understand, and no single individual or institution can have the wherewithal to engage strongly and sort of intellectually and stimulatingly in all of these issues. So it needs collective wisdom to be able to do that, right? And so what is in the domestic process that needs to sort of improve? As I agree with Apar, saying it's there, but it just needs to improve. And how do you improve it? That's going to be a tougher nut to crack. But it has to be a collective process. It has to be sort of bottom up. And I again hark back to my days in TRAI, when everybody is talking about TRAI and its very strong consultative process. That process also, the consultative process of TRAI, while it is good, while it goes to the metro, sometimes goes to smaller cities as well, that consultative process is also not, in terms of theoretically, it's not completely open. Because who has access to the internet, who has access to come to those meetings, who has the capacity to engage on those complex issues of net neutrality or floor pricing, etc. So there is going to be an exclusion. You want to reduce the exclusion, but by definition there is going to be exclusion in consultative process. Somebody has to champion the cause of consumers, somebody has to champion the cause of civil society. If the government can do it, very good, but NGOs can also help. Think tanks like us can help, and other civil society organizations can help in champion the cause of the underrepresented. As I said, if you're not on the table, you're on the plate. So, who are those underrepresented? Can they be put in the sort of mix of things so that their point of view also gets articulated? So a consultative process, by definition, is great, but it's never going to be completely inclusive. I mean, there will be some exclusion in that process as well, but try and make it as less as possible. And I want to end by saying two things about institutions that I firmly believe are attributes that every institution should have. One is legitimacy, the other is credibility. So whatever your institutions at home are going to do, they have to do it with legitimacy, and legitimacy obviously will come from the government. They will give you legitimacy to do that, and credibility can only come through the actions, through your actions. And if you're not legitimate, if you don't have credibility, then what will happen? There will be an erosion of what we have discussed through the morning and through the afternoon. There will be an erosion of trust between institutions. And when there is erosion of trust, you get to a position where we are in the telecom sector today. I think there is a complete trust deficit between the public, private, civil society, operators, etc., etc. And this lack of trust has come because there has been questioning of legitimacy of the institutions. There have been questions of regulatory capture. There has been questions of behavior which is inconsistent or conduct that is inconsistent by the institutions, and all this has created a complete trust deficit. So when you're preparing to engage in international fora, one has to ensure that whatever institutions that you've created, the domestic capacity that government helps to create, the engagement, it has both these attributes of several other attributes, that it is legitimate and it is credible. And once this is established, it is going to be difficult to do. As I said, I'm speaking conceptually. Of course, a lot of people have argued on how, during the day, on how this is possible to achieve. And I think it is possible to achieve that. But the institutions will have to be very strong. And we have to strengthen the institution. As I said, ICRIER sort of stands by in case there is any more work to be done. And as I said, there is so much more work to be done in this area that it's not only ICRIER or METI. There are so many actors in this space that can help in promoting our interest, our national interest in international fora. Whatever else happens domestically will happen. But I think internet governance is something that we have to promote at the international level, as well as prepare ourselves domestically so that we can make best use of this opportunity. There are some other things that I wanted to say, and the last thing I would say is, again, it's been said during the course of the day, is often we, and I've experienced this in my sort of decade-long association with policy and policymakers, there's some amount of lack of permanence and lack of continuity. And I think that's important if you're going to engage on a complex technical issue like internet and internet governance. As Gangesh was saying in the morning, that we made that switch from multi-stakeholder or multilateral to multi-stakeholder. And that switch has happened in 2015, and Mr. Govind sitting here was associated with that. And once that switch has happened, and you know that it's going to be a multilateral multi-stakeholder engagement, then the actors that engage should have the capacity. It's not that India doesn't have the capacity, as somebody was saying, but you should make use of the capacity so that it's sustained and it's permanent, so that the same people are represented by India over and over again. It doesn't help if there's lack of permanence, because you start then from a clean state. And I don't think that serves India or the governance or the institutions well. So my plea would be to METI or whoever engages from India in this process, is that there should be some amount of sustainability and some amount of continuity, because this is a complex issue, and it's not easy, and therefore permanence is desirable. So I'll stop here. I think this was, as I said, Santosh, this was an excellent conference. Do convey on behalf of ICRIER, Gangesh, Isha, Mansi, or this Koshambi, Richa, and all the young people from ICRIER who've been spearheading this project. Do convey from our side collectively to the Secretary Ajay ji as well as Jaideep ji, so that ICRIER has found it very stimulating to engage in this area, and we hope to continue doing that and strengthening the hands of METI. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for those closing remarks and really capturing the sentiment and the feel of what we are trying to discuss, and a lot of what was discussed. So I'd like to formally thank the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology for their consistent support and encouragement, Secretary Ajay Prakash Sahni, Joint Secretary Jaideep Kaur Mishra, and Scientist Santosh and his team, who have constantly supported us and encouraged us to continue working with the space. Thank you very much. I want to thank the panelists who made it from different parts of the country, in fact, and for others who took out time from their busy schedules to make it. And I want to thank you all especially for joining us and broadening the horizons of what we consider to be internet governance and really renewing the discussion. And I want to also, take an opportunity to shout out to the organizations who've been working in the space, fighting against, barriers of funding or capacity, and it's your timely interventions that have made this discussion what it is today. We would be discussing it very differently if it wasn't for that case. And the other stakeholders who have engaged with us in our stakeholder consultations and with our research, thank you very much. And special thanks to ICRIA's logistics and events team, because any request you throw to them at their last minute and they still do it. Thank you to our IT support, and thank you to my colleagues and team at ICRIA. But a very special thank you to all of you in the audience for being so engaged, and thank you so much. Thank you all.